new for some of you. So I'm just going to go around and have my colleagues who are helping me today introduce themselves. Ashley, can I start with you?
Yeah, hi, I'm Ashley. You've probably all had emails from me. I'm the Centre Manager at the Economics Network.
Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm from a faculty member at Loughborough University, and I want to talk about marking. I don't think we talk about marking enough, so I'm very pleased that this is happening today and pleased that you've joined us. Thank you.
Annika.
Hi everyone, I'm a senior lecturer in economics at Bristol. I've marked probably more than I would care to in my entire life, but I'm very happy to share any insights I've got from it over the years.
John.
Hi, I'm John. I'm from the economics department at Aston Business School, Aston University. I will contest with Annika that because I've been in this game for 30 years, I've probably marked even more than she has, and maybe have picked something up along the way.
Okay, thank you very much. We're not going to go in a competition. Your marking pile is bigger than mine here. So before we start that, let me share the screen. Here we go. Okay, so here are everyone contributing here and the link, but you've already seen that. What we're going to do today is we'll have a very quick UK marking HE assessment background, perhaps some things that you're unfamiliar with and which may be important in the background. Think about why does marking matter. We're going to think a little bit about the marking process, how to get consistency. I know some of you already were hoping for that. Some practicalities, the nitty-gritty, how to be productive. Very important, pay, and then in the end we'll have a FAQ section and where you can ask your questions, and we'll get back to the tablet and hopefully make sure that we've responded to most of the issues here. So that slide is for the Padlet. Please keep on entering comments on the Padlet. We'll get back to that in the end. So the UK HE environment. Let's start with this. Our degree classes, many of you will be familiar with that, some of you perhaps not. So I'm not going to, if you come from overseas, from Europe somewhere or the US. So this is what's on the forefront of our mind when students are being assessed here. We are basically at undergrad level having 5 categories: firsts, upper seconds, lower seconds, third class, and fail. And these sorts of categories map into a numerical scale, which goes from 0 to 100. And you may be familiar with that. Every grade above 70, including 70, is a first class, above 60, an upper second class, above 50, a lower second class, third class plus 40. And at undergraduate level, a grade below 40 is a fail grade. Now, students will get at the end, they will get a degree class in one of these categories. And what is really important about this is that especially the top 2 categories are important hurdles students need to jump to achieve certain things. For instance, if you want to go to very top class, very high level MSc degree, most likely you will require a first these days. Okay, and even then you may not be guaranteed a student to get a place. Many admission criteria for grad schemes and other very good master's degrees will ask for a 2-1 at least. So that's also the background why often you will hear that a 2-1 and a first class is what's called a good degree outcome. Now, before students get grades, so this is sort of the background why marking, what that leads to in the end. I want to very quickly show you what the actual process of marking looks like. In more detail, we'll see more later. So once a student sets the exam, it's an online exam in most cases these times, not necessarily. Okay, you, the humble teaching assistant, but I know there may be some lecturers amongst you, you'll do the marking. This marking will be then sort of checked by your course convener. Then there will be an internal departmental moderator, so another colleague from the department who may check the marking. Then there will be an external examiner, a colleague, an economist in our case, from another department who will look at a sample of exams and check the marking and the feedback given. Then these results will go to the exam board, who will have to approve grades, and only then a student will be given grades and will know what their grade is. All right, so this is the entire process. We are thinking about mainly that first step and in conjunction with the course convener here. So you will,
Ralf, can I just pop in at that point, mate? So we can just
absolutely.
go back to that. So what Ralph's just showed you is actually a useful thing to have to mind, because I think we may come back later on to what happens if students complain or challenge any marks. And some colleagues of mine in law have started giving this information much more directly to students, because I think some students think, oh, it's just the teaching assistant, the module leader just marks it and their word is God, and it's never moderated and it's never checked. So it's always useful to remind students that the marking goes through this process. It's quite rigorous. So I think actually, although we're providing this for you, it's actually a useful thing to maybe keep in the back of your mind if you ever are challenged by students.
Now, that's absolutely right. That's a good point. Alessia, there's a question from you guys.
Can I add just something on this?
Yeah.
I'll just introduce quickly myself. My name is Alessia Isopi. I'm a colleague with Ralf Becker at the University of Manchester. And today I'm really here to help and eventually share my views. To all of you guys doing the marking for the first time, although this is exactly the process, how does it work, the path that Ralf has just described. As a practical suggestion, mine will be, despite all of this, keep that in mind, but make sure that when you mark, you do that as thinking that no one else, apart from the student, will have a look to the paper. Because sometimes what can happen is that, oh, I'll do this, but then somebody else will double check that. And if we all do that, you know, there might be things that you rely on, you know, the course convener relies on you, an internal moderator, and then at some point that might create gaps. So this is a process that eventually guarantees everyone, and I think that allows to pick up lots of issues that, you know, may just slip throughout, but it's also very important then whenever you do it, you think about that no one else will ever see the script apart from the student.
I think that's very helpful advice. This cannot be an excuse for not doing things properly. I think that's absolutely right. So all universities will have here our 5 categories again. All universities and perhaps departments will have marking criteria where there's sort of a little narrative given to these to these marks, and perhaps even attributes like here, excellent answer, very good answer, good, sufficient. We'll get back, my colleagues, John and Chris will get back to this sort of thing later when it comes to the practicalities. And there may be sort of departmental or even university-wide criteria, or there may be criteria that are very bespoke to particular assessments. And we'll talk about both of these. This is just here to point to future bits in this assessment. Now, this is a pretty contentious issue. What are typical grade distributions here in the UK, one has to say, okay. Now, it's very rare that departments, and I'm not aware of any, will ask you to mark to a very specific distribution, right? So there's an understanding there isn't one right distribution, grade distribution, but there are some indicators of distributions that are possibly not right, okay? And so the 5 points we listed here is sort of what we came up with as possibly points that are true across our institutions, but there may be slight nuances in different distributions. So average grades outside the 58 to 65 range, okay? And I know in Manchester that would be up to 70. If you have more than 20% of students failing, or fewer than 10% firsts, or perhaps more than 30% firsts, or if you have too little spread in grades, so almost everyone has a 2-1 or 2-2, these would be indicators of perhaps you are not delivering the right sort of distribution. Again, may come to some of these aspects later, but the guidance here has to come from your course convener. Now, let me just briefly say why marking matters. Okay, and it matters at 3 levels for your department, for your course convener, and for your students. Now, for your students, we already said before, degree class will open some doors. So what I did here is I went to a typical grad scheme, looked at the Pride Network's website that collects details on lots of grad schemes, went to some sort of random grad scheme. And what you invariably will find in these grad schemes is something like this. You will need to have obtained or be studying towards a 2-1 or higher in any degree discipline, right? So this is why marking matters. And it's in the end what matters, their degree classification, but your marking in individual units will in some way contribute to that. Right? And then, of course, for students, marking is also a feedback opportunity. So we want to give feedback because we want to improve learning for students. And before I hand on, lastly, it is also important for your course convener in your department, the marking, and on a number of levels. Firstly, neither your course convener nor you want to spend any time doing the marking job again. Right? That's a little bit what Alessia pointed out before. If you are loose in what you do, it usually results in more work for someone else or for you again. We want to avoid students not understanding why they get grades, because if students don't understand grades, then again, that means more work afterwards for you or for your colleagues. We want to make sure that internal and external moderators think about the scheme we've thought out before, understand why a grade was given, and of course, we want that the students understand that. And that's a little bit what Alessia pointed out before. Assume that students can see the scripts, even if processes may be, different. Perhaps some universities don't make that easily available for students, but in the end, assume students can see the script. So whatever you leave on the script should be, printable. Okay, so with that, I will pass on to John. John, if you stop sharing the screen, if you please share.
I'm just hoping that it will allow me to share, being as my institution just hates me using Zoom so much.
Okay.
Is that sharing okay?
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Okay. So I just want to reiterate a couple of points that Ralph's referred to, and that is this idea that there may be expectations about grade distributions, and it's a peculiar thing that we don't in the UK mark to the curve as maybe they do in the States. We don't say, oh, there's a precise number of students who must get over 70% or whatever. But we do sort of fudge it. We do have a sort of distribution that we sort of expect, that Ralf has previously talked about. Now, that is quite controversial, and it may well vary from department, from module leader to module leader, but it might just be worth, before you start marking, just to get some ideas of if there is this expectation from the person who's leading the module. I think another important thing when you start is just to be clear about the expectations about feedback. So let's imagine whether online or you've got physical scripts, is the expectation that you should leave any comments on the individual scripts or online assignments? Or is it absolutely clear that in some modules, some universities will say you shouldn't do that, okay? But then there might be some expectation that you provide comments to a more generic final feedback sheet that is provided with the students. So I think before you start marking, that's something that I think you just want to be clear about. Are you expected to make some sort of feedback comments on individual assignments? So, as I said, some places will be absolutely clear that they don't want you to do that. Some places, some module leaders may say, yeah, I just want a couple of feedback comments. And again, even if it's not expected at the individual level of the individual assignment, if let's say you're marking a particular question or a particular batch of questions, the module leader might expect you to provide some common weaknesses or some common strengths on the work that you've looked at. So it's worth, if that's true, making a few notes as you go along through the marking process. identifying those sort of common strengths and weaknesses, rather than having to go back through them all later and do that. I think another quick thing as well is that it's quite important that your comments align to the mark. So sometimes students will get very frustrated if somebody puts excellent, this is a brilliant piece of work at 58%. So I think it's very important that any descriptions that you use are consistent with the marks that you give. And if you go back again to that previous assessment criteria, there may be some of those words about excellent or good or whatever, and that should really align to the mark that you give. But what I want to just spend my sort of next 5 minutes talking about is the point that Ralf just made about how important this is. And obviously, it's very, very important that the marks don't vary with the person marking the work. What we really strive for, and I imagine many of you will be working on quite large modules, you know, 200 to 700 students maybe. There'll be a team of markers. And the key here is, as best as we can, to get consistency between those markers, okay? And really, I can't think of I can't really think of a university where this wouldn't be the case, but you should be provided with some type of written guidance before you start marking, okay? And that could be some type of marking guide, some sort of assessment criteria, some rubric with grade descriptors, okay? Some of these can be provided at a sort of broader level. They're quite generic. Sometimes module leaders will provide very specific assessment criteria for that particular piece of work. And these are really important because the evidence suggests that without this written guidance, without this assessment criteria, we've got very little chance of different markers marking work consistently, or what I would call intermarker consistency. But I think what we've learned in over the last 10, 15 years is we shouldn't overestimate what the written guidance on its own can achieve. Okay, and as I put here on the slide, the written guidance is a necessary, but it isn't a sufficient condition for consistency. And I'm just going to prove that with you, but I'll just get you to look at this for a minute. Okay, so this is created from a piece of research that, as it says on the slide, was published in Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education. And unfortunately, it's not economics. I wish it was, but I think from memory, these might have been history essays. And what the researchers did was give 5 essays, so essay A, essay B, C, D, E. So these 5 common essays, they were copied and anonymized, and it gave them to 6 different individuals at different universities to mark, okay? And I think the important thing to stress about those 6 individuals is they all had at least 20 years of experience of teaching and grading in higher education in the UK, and they had all acted as external examiners. So these were very experienced people, and they were given a quite detailed assessment criteria, and they were asked to mark these essays. And what you obviously have here is a summary of how they graded them. And maybe I'll just let you have a quick look at that for a minute and see if anything jumps out the page. Anybody want to put any comments in the chat on that data? And I stress this is all people with at least 20 years of experience, and they've all acted as external examiners, the 6 individuals, and they were all given quite detailed written assessment criteria to mark the essays. Any comments in the chat at all?
So we've got 2 so far, John. One says the mark, thanks Carl, the mark seems fairly random. Fatima, inconsistent results except E. Matthew,
Yeah.
SE. Yeah.
Cheers, Chris. Yeah, it's interesting. It's not just that one marker is a more lenient marker than another, but ranks all the essays consistently. I think what the comments picked up on is the fact that different markers ranked the essays, whichever scale we use. That whoever thought was this essay was the best essay, this was the second best, this was the third, fourth, fifth best. There's not actually a massive amount of consistency between the markers. And that's quite it. And remember, I stress this is people with 20 years experience. So I go back to the point, written guidance is important, it's necessary, and you should expect it of the module leader, but it's not a sufficient condition to get consistency between different markers. So I think it's really, really important, if we're going to try and get into marker consistency, that there's some discussion. And quite often a module leader who you're working with might mark a sample and then let you see that sample and maybe hopefully provide some explanations behind what they've done. And that's great, that will help, but that's a bit of a one-way communication method. That's just the module leader communicating one way with their teaching assistants. Probably in a more ideal world, we would get people together, maybe online or physically, marking and grading the same answers and discussing why they gave the grade that they did, so we can get a sort of a better appreciation of what we're looking for, when we're marking, and in particular, hopefully, as teaching assistants, you can then really get to discuss with the module leader what they're looking for. And then I think this other point is really important, and that is, ideally, you want some interim moderation. So in an ideal world, what you don't want to do is mark 150 pieces of work and then the module leader to say, oh, well, I'm not happy about this, I want you to mark them all again. I think it's really, really important to maybe mark a dozen and then get the module leader, just have a quick check through them to make sure they're happy with their marking, to discuss them. Again, I wouldn't, you need to, if you don't understand what the module leader is asking for, then I think it is important to try and sort of ask what it is, where you're getting it wrong, what the module leader is looking for that maybe you're not picking up. But you want to make sure that you do a few and then you share those with the module leaders and they just check you're on the right lines, rather than mark 150 and then go back and have to mark all over again. Some people might say, well, this isn't such an issue with quantitative work. This will be an issue only with discursive work, but I don't need to worry about this because this won't be an issue with more quantitative work. But I challenge that a bit, because often with quantitative work, there may be stages to the answers, and you may have to get some agreement about what you do with work if somebody makes an error early in the piece of the calculation, and that error is then carried through, but the methodology using the error is correct, even though it gives the wrong answer. And if you don't get an agreement on that, even with quantitative answers, you can end up with very, very different grades being given to the same piece of work. So what exactly you do with mistakes that are then carried through to later calculations, I think that's also a really important issue. So to summarize, I would expect from your module leader should provide you with some written guidance, some assessment criteria to how to grade these bits of work, but we can't just rely on that without some examples, discussion, in an ideal world, some two-way discussion between the module leader and the team of markers, so that they can get this sort of shared view of what good is, what average is, and how to apply the grading specifically. I'll finish off with when I became an assessor for the Government Economics Service, so I got involved with the graduate recruitment process where students have to produce work. We actually spent a whole day marking examples of student work and then discussing our grading and why we gave what we did. And it did take us quite, obviously it's a graduate assessment centre. It's really, really important that we are consistent. But, I was a lot more confident after going through that process than I would have been beforehand. Right, I'm going to stop sharing. And pass over, I think, to Chris, who's going to get into the real nitty-gritty and some practical tips about marking.
Heard from John. I'm imagining now in the process that you've had your instructions with your course leader, your module leader. You've had that sort of consensus building of what marks to give for different situations, and now we enter the phase where it's just you and the scripts, just you and the hundreds of scripts on your desk. And we're going to just talk through what you might go through now in terms of process when it's just left to your own devices. So I'm going to talk about setting up. I'm going to talk about the approach that you might take, what to write on the script, and how much to check your own marking. Okay, so setting up. So I'm imagining here, these are the sort of key elements that you might have when setting up. So obviously you've got your big pile of scripts. Obviously, you've got your some kind of guidance that, as John's been talking about, from the module leader, whether it's your marking criteria, rubric, instructions. Hopefully, you've had some past examples that you've been talking about with your module leader and your other co-markers about, what this is a 2-1, and there's some idea of that. And then I want to talk a bit about this last element, which I think is really important: your marking spreadsheet. So this is often either a shared sort of live spreadsheet on Google Docs or something, where people are marking into it from different angles, or perhaps you've got your own copy that then the module leader will sort of merge at the end phase. So this marking spreadsheet is really important. What you may find, actually, it constantly surprises me, is some faculty members won't use a spreadsheet until the very end of the process. They'll mark the scripts, they'll write the marks onto the scripts, and then at the very end of the process, they'll then convert that into a spreadsheet. But I think that misses the point a lot. I think marking spreadsheets are not just for recording marks, and they're not just something to do at the end. Okay, they actually play a very key role as you go along in the marking process, because it serves quite a few purposes. For example, and I'll give you an example in a moment, but it helps you monitor the mark distribution. We've just been hearing from Ralf and John about the idea of sort of an expectation of how the grade distribution will roughly lie. You can monitor that yourself as you're marking, so that you don't come to that end of the process and you've got an average of 40 or something. You can monitor this as you go along. It's also useful for consistency. We all have to be aware that we will vary in our marking. What you don't want, of course, is the first day you mark, you average 60, and then on the second day you mark, you're averaging 40 or something, just because, of how you feel that day, or you've got a slightly different interpretation of things as you're marking more, you're changing. You want that consistency. You don't want to do that, do you? So again, this is a device that allows you to monitor your own intra-marker consistency, perhaps. And then finally, it really plays a useful purpose in error checking at the end of the process. We're going to talk about checking in a moment. But again, if you have a spreadsheet, it gives a layer of sort of error finding abilities and an extra layer of checking that you can use to filter out any little mistakes that might have crept in. To actually use the spreadsheet, I find it really, really useful to make sure the order of my spreadsheet, the order of students on the spreadsheet, corresponds to the order of students on my scripts. And if I can do that, then I can mark quite in a concentrated manner without having to worry about, oh, who's this student, what's that student? If they're in the same order, I can just go down as quick as I can. Alternatively, if you can't do that, or if it's difficult to do that, then you might end up using the find function in Excel, which is what I'm just going to try and show you now. Okay, so this is an example spreadsheet. I'm sure they can look totally different, but here I've got the student ID number. Your module leader probably will provide this for you. And then we've got the different marks for the different questions here. And then there's various equations that are forming the final exam mark and things like that. Okay. Now, first few things to point out here is one, I quite like working with desk numbers. So typically, these ID numbers for students can be quite complicated, and it's sometimes much easier to refer to the desk that they're sitting on. That might be on the front of the script along with the ID number as well. And so you may find, as long as these are unique, that these are a useful quick identifier rather than getting confused and complicated with all these difficult ID numbers. Secondly, you can see here I've got some sort of summary statistics here, and obviously this could be done in a more complicated way, but here I've got the average. So for the average for question 1, I'm monitoring is 17 marks. Again, that can be used for that consistency checking, monitoring as we go along. And then over here, I've built a little sort of a few equations here to work out my distribution. So this is based on the total exam mark. And I can see as I'm going along, I can see that, well, 50% have got a 2-1 so far, 25% have got a first, and I can be using that as I go along. Finally, just in case you can't order the scripts in the spreadsheet in a synchronized way, as I mentioned, it might be that you pick up script, pick up a script and you've got to enter the marks. Well, here you can use this find function. And I can just I can type in a particular ID number and find that. And then Excel will, of course, find that row for me. That's really useful if you've got hundreds of students and you can't synchronize the order. Okay, a word about approach now. Okay, so I think different markers have different approaches. And I'm just going to ask you to think about this before you start jumping into marking. Are you going to mark by question, by script, or are you going to use a combination of these approaches? What do I mean by this? Okay, so the by question approach is focusing and saying, right, I'm going to mark all the question 1s that I've got to do first. Then I'm going to mark all the question 2s. Then I'm going to mark all the question 3s, etc. Okay, that's very useful. I prefer that method. I find it useful because it allows the marker to have less in their head at any one point in time. All I have to remember is the marking sort of instructions and criteria for question 1 at a time. That makes it easier. I think that makes it quicker, and it allows me to be more consistent as well. Okay, the difficulties are with that is that then I'm obviously moving between scripts more, and if I'm sharing my marking with a team, then I might have to share or swap scripts with other people more. Well, I've done the question 1s here, and this is you're doing question 2. I've got to give them to you. Okay, and that can cause some sort of logistical problems. But ideally, I think this is the more effective method. The alternative to that is by script, and this is where I just pick up a script and I say, right, I'm going to mark question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this script, and then put it down and then get the next script. That, as I said, is quite hard because you have to memorize or sort of, have it in your working memory, all the different aspects of all the different questions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the same time. And that might make it harder, more tiring, but it might make it more practically easy, depending on your circumstance. Or, of course, you could use a mixture of these. Maybe some of the harder questions, I've really got to focus on those. So I'm going to mark those by question, but the rest are relatively easy to remember. Maybe I can do that by script. Okay, so how you choose to approach things will vary, I think, depending on your experience and maybe what level the module is, what type of subject the module is, how many questions are in the script, whether you're marking online exams or physical scripts will also influence this, but just encouraging you to think about it before you jump in. Right, what to write on the script here. So as we've mentioned before, the sort of rules about this will vary. The recommendations will vary across institutions, but hopefully everyone will have this fairly standardly. We need to write the marks on the script, of course, don't we? Okay, so typically some questions will have sub-questions, question 1, part A, B, C, and you might need to give a mark, a sort of sub-question mark for each part, A, B, C, and then you'll need to give a total mark for question 1, for example. So sometimes it's quite useful to use those in a different format so that people can distinguish between, oh, that's a part mark, oh, that's a question mark. So I tend to use circles for sub-questions and then a total mark for each question in boxes, as I'll show you in a moment. And then again, depending on the process, but often at the front of the script, there'll be a summary box where you have to write the question marks on the front as well. So just to show you an example of this, it's not ideal, but this was from COVID times where we had online exams here rather than showing you a physical script. So on the front of the script, it would look something like this, where you can see there's a summary box for question 2 and question 4A and 4B. We've got different part marks, question marks there, and then there's a total for the exam itself. Here's a relatively quantitative question. And so these in circles, these are sub-question marks. So this is the mark for question 2A, and then we've got a mark for question B, okay, and then we go through, and then the sum of these will then form the boxed mark here, 24 marks for the sum of question 2. And that distinction is quite useful for checkers when they're going through, they're really sort of hanging on to this. You can see here, we're going to talk about comments here. Let me just go back to this now. Okay, so how much to actually write in terms of comments on the script? So comments are important for checkers to sort of justify, well, why have you done this? Well, I've done this because that was wrong and that wasn't so good. And then, as we've been talking about, also to provide justification and feedback to students. Sometimes they have access to the script so they can see what you've marked. Sometimes they don't, but they can have the rights to sort of ask for more feedback, for example. So these little comments and things on the script will either allow students to get the feedback, or they'll allow staff members or yourself to provide feedback to the student after the exam. So it's very useful just to write a little bit on the script, because otherwise, if you don't, and you have to go back to the script, or for the student has to see why you gave that mark, then that just gives an indicator of why you did that. Okay, if you don't write anything, the risk is you'll have to sort of think, well, why did I give 58 here? And you'll have to basically remark it. So it's useful to write a bit, especially I think for qualitative questions. So for example, here, this is an essay. I've got my own little code sometimes. So here, E, this means something sort of special. This is something maybe I didn't teach and they've added in. I've thought, oh, wow, that's nice. And then you'll just see a few comments here, you know, poorly explained, or they've missed out this condition on the parameters here. Just, it doesn't need to be a lot, but just enough to say, well, I'm justifying my mark here. Yeah, this was missing, you know, this was poorly explained. And then at the end of the question, if it was a physical script, I'd probably write it in here, but because it's online, I've just said here, you know, a little summary, right, 20 marks, many omissions, poorly explained. And then again, that's just give me a little summary reminder if I need it at a later point. Finally, let's just move on to how much to check at the end of the process here. So at some point after the marking, a checking procedure should take place. John's talked about the inter-marking consistency, checking that I'm being consistent with John. But here I'm talking about the intra-marking consistency. Have I, as a marker, have I done things properly? So I think somewhere along the line, we've got to check that all those sub-question marks correctly add up to the total question mark. I've got to check that the question marks on the front of the script on that summary page correspond to what's actually inside the script. I've got to check that the marks on the front of the script equally correspond to my spreadsheet. And I've got to finally check that the exam mark, total, final mark on the front of the script corresponds to the spreadsheet. Okay, if that wasn't the case, a student challenged a mark and there were found to be errors in this, then of course it throws into doubt the whole marking process and leads to a lot of distrust amongst students, and it gets very messy. So this is an important process. So different module leaders, course leaders will have different processes here. It might be that you're expected to do this at the end of your batch. You should check your batch. Or it might be that everyone brings all the scripts together and then somebody checks the whole sort of cohort as a whole at the end. So ask your module leader, should I be checking? When should I be checking? Who should be checking? And then finally, during this process, I think it's much easier with 2 people, actually, if you can. So maybe you could team up with another one of the markers. If one person that has the scripts and they're reading out, right, question 2, 17, question 3, 14, and somebody else is on the spreadsheet saying, yeah, that's right, then that's a really effective, efficient way of doing it. But it does build in that further sort of channel for checking and consistency. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Annika now.
Sorry, Chris, can I just jump in there? That
sorry, John. Yeah.
That not only with assistant markers, but if you've got a very understanding partner, at 8 o'clock last night, I was going through exactly that process, but my wife was, we were doing online marker checking, and I thought, what better to do on a Sunday evening with my wife than to get her to help me double check marks, because that's the sort of thing you do when you've been as married as long as I have.
What fun you have, John. What fun you have. Right, good. Over to Annika now. Annika, you're going to tell us about being productive and effective, I think, aren't you?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I guess the one thing I'd add to Chris's bit as well, that all the checking stuff, I think it really matters in UK. So, most UK institutions, students can't actually challenge marks just because they don't like them. To challenge them, they have to show that there's actually been some break in the marking procedure as laid out by the university. And, marks not adding up correctly or comments not making sense alongside what's written is sort of an indication something has gone badly wrong. So, but that would give students cause to complain successfully.
And actually, Annika, just coming in, I have been in exam boards where an external has said, I was looking at a paper where the marks didn't add up. And then the embarrassment that causes to staff at an exam board might make them then go and chase the person who maybe did the marking, and you may, it can, because of the embarrassment that it can put people in, you don't want irate course leaders after you because they've just been made to look a little embarrassed at a program board.
That's very true. I mean, as an external examiner as well, I always appreciate it if people would be giving marks for like subparts and then also marks for whole questions, that they make it clear which ones have gone into the final marks. So being clear is always helpful. Anyway, let's talk about being productive. I wanted to suggest 2 approaches one might take to marking. I'll be honest, I've taken both of these approaches in my marking lifetime. This is the one I would not recommend. Day 1, go to the office, get a big pile of scripts, or get them in your inbox, one of the 2. And do all that compulsory benchmarking stuff or moderating, the bit at the beginning where you get together with colleagues who are also marking and you will standardize what you're looking at before you start marking. Then wait an extremely long period of time, leave the scripts somewhere safe and let them sort of mature in the filing cabinet, just until they're nice and ripe and ready to mark. And then at the end of your 2-week marking period, actually start marking. You'll mark like crazy and you won't sleep. This is obviously a really bad way to do it. Okay, it's bad because you're going to be extremely stressed at the end, but it's also bad because it's a really long distance from when you first did all that standardization and got all that consistency in place. You've probably lost it by the end of 2 weeks. Okay, practically the only good thing you will have done in this process is made sure that all the scripts were secure, which is always nice to do. I'd never recommend taking them off campus if you've got physical scripts. Okay, so I don't recommend this. If I want to do marking successfully, I don't want to end up feeling like this at the end. Okay. On the other hand, here's a better approach. Hopefully, when your marking is coming, roughly. When the exam is, or when the coursework deadline is, so roughly when the marking is going to start. So you can plan a little bit ahead of time. And that there's going to be some period where you get the scripts in. And where you're going to do that early moderation, benchmarking, consistency checking at the beginning process. The other thing I would always recommend you do at the beginning, especially if you've got physical paper scripts, not just on a computer, is count what you get in. An exam paper going missing is a really big deal. You know, I'm sure you can imagine if it was you who'd written your exam, you'd be extremely worried. It's a big deal for a university to lose scripts. So as well as making sure you always keep them somewhere secure, when you first get them in, do count them, even if it's a few hundred. And if you don't have the number that the office or whoever you've got them from thinks they've given you, then it's important to flag it at that early stage so that you're not the one accountable for any missing scripts. Okay, and then you're going to have some period over which you have to complete this. Maybe it's 2 weeks, maybe it's 2 or 3 days. It's going to depend on the size of what you're marking and your institution. What's important over the period is not that you mark exactly the same every time. I would always suggest planning to start with quite a small batch. Mark some. You're always going to start slowly while you're getting used to the mark scheme. And plan to sort of be slow maybe the first couple of times you're marking. By the time you're at your 3rd or 4th batch, you can probably mark a lot more in the same period because you'll be getting much faster. And it's definitely okay to leave some time between marking. I just say try not to make it too long, or you'll lose all your consistency along the way. So, have some rest days if you've got a particularly large batch. And I think here I first wrote you should mark little and often, but probably not too little in marking. Marking just one script is obviously not particularly helpful. But break it down into manageable batches and do that often until you're done. Okay. If you try to do too much, you're getting too tired. You'll just fall into all those effects of, marking badly or marking according to what the last mark you gave on the previous paper was, and so on. So good marking tends to come from doing manageable batches often until you're done.
Sorry, Annika, can I just to
go for it.
There is some academic research that's been done that says if you mark for very long periods of time, as you get fatigued, the range of your marking begins to narrow. You just start handing everything 58 to 65. And then you end up having to spend more time when you're checking your marks because you realise you've got terribly inconsistent. So don't fall into the trap of thinking, oh, I'm just going to crash this and do a load, because it actually probably will end up spending you more time in the long run.
Way longer. That's absolutely true. And then once you're done with that, hopefully that should allow you to finish a little bit ahead of time or on time. You can return the scripts, you can smile, and you can relax a bit. It's often, I found on my PhD at least, it was one of the rare points where I actually felt like I'd achieved something complete and it was like final and I'd done it. And you don't often get that final point. So, try to go for this feeling more than this feeling. That's kind of, you're kind of anchoring to the previous one that you did. So I think sometimes if I have those really large batches, I'll sometimes divide it into, say, batches of 30, and I'll mark all of question 1 for those 30 and then all of question 2. And maybe I'll do that for like part A. And I do find I need to sort of keep it a little bit fresh. But I would just recommend finding something that works and feels efficient for you. If they are physical scripts, the only thing I will say is it's really important to make sure that it's normally really important anyway to make sure you keep them in the same order. Because you don't want to be sitting around on the floor of somebody's office trying to put 200 scripts back into order at the end. But if you do mark in small batches, I don't know, say you mark all of question 1, you mark 30 scripts, you mark all of question 1, then all of question 2, then all of question 3, and then you move on to a second batch of 30. That's where Chris's spreadsheet becomes really useful as well, because you can sort of notice if you changed anything dramatically across those batches. So yeah. But in a sort of short phrase, manageable batches and often is definitely the way I would go, as much as you can with whatever deadlines you've got. Okay, so that's kind of it across time. I thought I'd try and write down also what I still do in a single marking session. So like, I'm going to spend a morning marking, what am I going to do? And I think it kind of begins with like setting up your space. make sure you've got absolutely everything you need. Chris mentioned some of these earlier, right? So obviously you've got scripts, you've got mark schemes, marking record sheets. I also like to keep a notebook around or post-it notes. Sometimes when I'm marking other people's exams, I find myself, especially in the early stages, coming up with sort of questions of like, is that the shift of the curve they intended, or is this alternative shift okay? And all of those can be valid questions, but sometimes when you're marking at the start, it's really hard to know whether that's going to be the question that makes a difference between a third and a first, or a question that makes a difference between 75 and 76, you know, so the importance of those questions isn't always known at the beginning. And if I let myself get all wrapped up in that question and think, oh, I'm not sure, or every time I come across one of those issues, I go off and I have a conversation with somebody to work it out, then it actually means I never get through the marking. So just by having a notebook on side or post-it notes that I can put directly into you know, sort of sticking out the edge of a script so I can clearly see where it was, I find that a more efficient way to deal with it, and I can sort of come back to it later and think whether it means I should change what I did. Try and turn off anything that you don't need to mark. This is not the first time I've spoken about this at an economics network event, so I feel like I'm advertising, but I actually use one of these like apps on my phone to like lock my phone for a little bit, just that I'm not tempted to go and look at lots of email and things and pretty much do anything else but marking. So I actually use this one, but I'm sure there's tons of others out there. I like this one because basically a tree grows while your phone is locked and it looks cool. And if you plant lots of fake trees, then eventually they plant a real tree, and that's nice. But I would just, you know, the message really is just remove as many distractions from yourself as possible. Because there are points in the marking where it's like, I just don't know, or I'd rather do anything else. It's important to try and stay in the marking zone. I like to mark with music. Some people do, some people don't. Do what works for you. I'd say the only thing is I try and use music I either already know or that doesn't have any words, so it's not too distracting for me. I'll talk about clocks and timers in a minute, and make sure you've got any water or food that you think you might need. Most of all, as far as possible, find a quiet space and just make a plan of what you're going to do. Are you going to mark all the question ones? Are you going to mark all the questions on 30 scripts? You know, decide what you're going to do. Right, during the session, I borrowed this from some professional services colleagues. This is how they run the admissions to the universities. They talk a lot about getting into the flow state. So you concentrate on one particular task that's quite sort of repetitive, but for a fixed period of time. I think that fits very well with how we've spoken about marking question by question and so on. And try and just keep going until your target. And any problems and issues you come up with, put them on your notebook, put them on the post-it notes. You can revisit it in a little while. I've said already, if you've got paper exams, make sure you keep the scripts in order. And if you've got an online exam, then make sure you save any sort of comments that you've made, particularly if they're lengthy, so that you can copy and paste them back again. Most importantly, this just shows, I think I'm quite a weak-willed person, but do resist any desire to check emails, social media, and so on. You'll break your concentration. You won't come back to it. And if you find, so when you're at the beginning here, you are going to be marking slowly. But if you find that you're not starting to mark faster, so you're not marking bigger and bigger in piles by the time you come back to it, then it can be useful to try and use a timer per question. You know, it depends how long the script you're looking at is. You know, if it's a 15 minutes for an essay or whatever it is, you know, 10 minutes for a script or something. Use a timer, just sort of keep track of what you're doing and maybe prompt yourself into some better marking. There can be points, I think, where you over focus on a little question because you're not quite sure or something like that. And sometimes using a timer can sort of force yourself to make a decision, decide whether you're going to go up or down on the marks and sort of stick with it. So don't be afraid to use that to sort of nudge yourself into being faster as well. At the end of a marking session, I normally write myself just a sentence to tell myself where to pick up next time. For example, which script number I'm starting with, or which question number I'm going to next. And it's really, really important to avoid all those effects that John spoke about earlier, where you fall into the trap of giving everybody the same mark. Take a break, have a stretch, do go and see some daylight, and just sort of reconnect with the world a little bit. It may be that in the marking of your exam, you kind of come across some funny answers or things that just frustrate you because you spent a whole term saying one thing and then students have done another. I think we all get frustrated sometimes when we mark, or we think, I can't believe they wrote that. But do resist all temptations to put anything on social media or, sort of discuss it outside of your workplace. Just find a colleague around a water cooler to go and have a moan to, I think. Keep it off the internet. I think that's a note. Over to you, Ralf.
Thanks, Annika. I'm almost looking forward to the upcoming marking to try and implement all your little tips and tricks. So hang on, I need to go through to the right spot. Yeah,
I think just while Ralph's finding that, I think I pick up on from experience what Annika said about it's almost like this path dependency on how you get to a piece of work. If you've marked 3 pieces of work that are soul destroying, and you think what are these people written? It's all rubbish, and then you get to an average one, or you've just marked 3 brilliant pieces of work and then you get to that same average one. You just have to be really careful that you haven't been influenced. You don't get this sort of contrast effect. Now, there is some evidence that actually, all I'll say to you, there's some evidence that people underestimate how strong this effect is. We may all have some awareness of it, but there is some evidence in psychology research that we underestimate how strong this bias is. So just always, if you've marked 3 rubbish ones, you go, oh my God, this one's just average, it's brilliant. Just be careful not to over reward it and vice versa. Right, I'll hand over to you, Ralf.
Okay, thanks, John, and thanks, Annika. So now let's go to perhaps one of the pieces of things that motivates us for marking, because quite frankly, I don't think we've said that. Marking is typically the part of the job that us as academics, we enjoy the least, and that's perfectly fine if that is the case for you as well. Okay, and if that is so, then there's always the pay, okay, to perhaps give you a bit of motivation. Now, some of you, if you're employed as a teaching assistant, then sort of marking the pay will be arranged with you either perhaps by script or perhaps by time, that you're being paid a certain number of hours by time. Now, the people, I think I want to put you at ease that the people in the department, they do want to pay you for the amount of work you do. I haven't come across anyone in economics department yet where sort of the administrators or the leaders of the department are hoping to sort of squeeze extra time out of you. Okay, so we'll in the end, we want you to come back next year and do the job again. And if we were to mistreat you here, then the likelihood is that you wouldn't want to do that again. But whatever is arranged in advance, whoever arranges your pay doesn't know exactly how long it takes to mark a script, because these decisions are made at with imperfect information. And so the process of making sure that you get paid what you should be paid is a process that certainly involves you as well as the teaching assistant. Okay, so you should, and Annika already said, you should perhaps keep a little bit of a note how long you're taking, also as a productivity tool for yourself, but also to keep track on, is it working out that time that I'm being paid for? And keep in mind that indeed, don't mark 10 scripts and then say, hey, this is taking double the time. That's possibly expected at the beginning, as Annika said, and I think Chris as well, the beginning, it will take more time to mark scripts. So before you make any judgment, you have to mark a sensible amount of scripts. But if in the end you realize this just isn't working out left, right, and center, we don't want you to either just sulk and complain to others. And we also don't want you just to say, okay, I'll just spending half the time for the marking. I'm not gonna do a thorough job. I'll just spend half the time. What we want you to do is that you, have a conversation with someone. I think in the first instance with your course convener, and then depending on the department with, whoever is the person that does, is sort of in the end responsible for your pay. Okay. And there's really no sort of clear guidance to these conversations other than you should go in these conversations understanding that nobody is here to shaft you. On the other hand, of course, it may turn out that the budgeted hours are much more than what you need. And I think in that case, what I would hope my colleagues would do if they're paid for that you go to your course convener and say, hey, I think this is working quite well. Can I help you with perhaps some of that admin checking that Chris talked about beforehand? I feel I'm good. I haven't checked that with my colleagues in the other departments. We would never try and claw back, money. I think that's pretty obvious in our department. But perhaps you can, perhaps it may be that someone else needs some help with it. Someone else has been asked to mark another question, which takes much more time. Perhaps there's some sort of activity you can help that person with. So this is really, I should say, and I know Annika reminded me before, some of you, especially if you're PhD students, you may have arrangements with your department that as part of your scholarship, perhaps you're meant to do some teaching and perhaps some marking, in which case there may not be a super explicit arrangement between you and your department as to how much work you ought to do as part of this. And I think if that's the case, you should possibly seek a conversation with whoever is responsible for your arrangement beforehand to agree on what sort of time effort would be expected for you throughout the exam period on this arrangement. Annika, do you have any extra thoughts on this?
I was just going to say, I think sometimes if you're marking for different module leaders, they don't necessarily know what your other commitments are. And I know I've had occasions where I've had like 2 module leaders come to me and say, I need this all marked, within 48 hours. It's not possible, and nobody wants a bad job done. So I just think now that I am a module leader, I know all that I ask is that people tell me, preferably ahead of time, if they know ahead of time, that they've got these different pressures, and I can try and build the marking process to accommodate. So I think if you've got pressures of marking too much in too short a space of time, it's just really important to communicate with people, tell them what your pressures are, and then try and find a solution.
Yeah, I think that's super important, Annika, to help your course conveners who don't have that overview, and encourage them, ask them now, hey, when do you, if they haven't told you yet, at the end of this meeting, you're first going to fill in the feedback form for us, and then immediately after that, you're going to send an email to your course convener and ask, hey, when can I expect to have to do marking? Okay, so I think with that, that's the pay section finished. And Annika, I'll pass on to you. You have anticipated a few problems, right?
Sure. So every marking period, every year, there's always new challenges that pop up. So we've tried to think of some of the ones that you might hear about this year. So here's the 3 I've picked up. I think Ralf might have a couple he wants to add in a minute. The first one, you can see the sort of visual puns my students are subjected to on a daily basis. The first one is cheating. if students are, if you suspect something is wrong with the answers in the sense that it's not the student's own work, or you think that they've been poor academic practice or plagiarism, that's something that's sort of a perennial problem that comes every time. I'll come back to that in a sec. There's a number of ways you might detect this, and how you detect it is going to depend on the type of thing that you're looking at. If you're marking online and it's not been an invigilated exam, then you might be able to look at sort of the auto-generated scores. So my institution uses Turnitin, and for every piece of work I get both a similarity score and an AI score. So it would look something like this. So this person's piece of work, the red number tells me that 30% of their text is similar to other sources. I'm not that surprised when I actually look at it, because this bit here, they've just copied the question that I'd asked them, and that's what's similar throughout, so they've included the question. So that's obviously not an issue, and I'm not going to worry about that 30%. If 30% was similar to another student's work, or somebody's work outside the institution, then that might be cause for concern. AI scores are relatively new. Not all institutions are trialing them. I happen to be at one that is. And the AI score in this case would tell me the percentage of the text which it considers is 98% likely to have been generated by AI. My institution hasn't actually told me a particular threshold that they're worried about. I think institutions are still developing, their rules around these things. Mine actually says they're not allowed to use things like ChatGPT at all. Whereas I think other institutions might allow for the fact that students might use it for sort of helping to structure an answer in the first place before writing it. So these scores are relatively new. And it's definitely, in particular with AI, it's going to vary across institution as to how it's dealt with. What I will say, and this is maybe a little bit of an unsatisfactory answer, it's really important that you know the rules of your local institution. And I would find these out roughly. You'd have to know all the little details, but understand in general, if you have a suspicion about a piece of work, what is it you're supposed to do? How do you report it? And who do you report it to? It's very rare you're going to have to do more than that with it, I think. And if I'm marking and I suspect something's come up, again, I just make a note of the number of the script that I've got the issue with. And in my case, I then report that to the module leader, and they'll take a look and deal with it from there. But you really do have to follow your local institution's lead on this. I don't know if you saw it in the past few days, there's been a few news articles about universities dealing really badly with accusations of plagiarism and poor academic misconduct. So it's just important that whatever you do is in line, at least, with whatever the institution's rules are.
Sorry, Annika, I'll just come in there. I think absolutely, that your institution will have a set of rules to follow for basic plagiarism that's been picked up on something like Turnitin. I think it would be fair to say at most institutions, where it comes to AI or ChatGPT, I'm not convinced you're going to get a fantastically clear set of guidelines from your centre. I think most universities are struggling with this. If you do get a really clear answer, you'll probably be very fortunate, in a very fortunate position. I think we're in a position still where nobody quite knows what to do about it. So the standard plagiarism check, something that comes up on Turnitin, you will have a very set procedure. Every university will have one, but how to deal with AI, I think we're all groping around in the dark still at the moment, and you probably won't get, to repeat really the point Annika made, you probably won't get a very clear answer to how to deal with it.
I still think it's worth having the sort of discussion with whoever the teaching lead is in your school, just to find out if something like that comes up, what would they hope you would do, maybe, rather than, I mean, other than scores, there are other things that can give away plagiarism and poor practice, right? My favorite one that comes out of AI is like when it mentions the chatbot's name in the answer. This is just incredibly lazy, really, that they haven't gone and edited it out. In my institution, people have actually been given 0 if it's that clear, or they actually talk about having used ChatGPT. But that is going to vary. Other things that might be signs but not proof of plagiarism or use of chatbots that weren't allowed is things like repetition of phrases from the question with no progression to an actual answer. The trouble is this is also something that you might just see in a genuinely poor answer that somebody's generated themselves, and that's where the difficulty for the institution comes in. If I'm honest, the types of plagiarism I've actually picked up over the years haven't been nothing to do with Turnitin or AI scores. It's been more like I've been marking scripts back to back and found that there's just a number with completely identical sentence structures and errors within those sentence structures. And it's the errors that normally give it away. But even then, when I identify it, so my school has a plagiarism officer, I just report it and then it gets dealt with by them if they think there's something to pursue. Other things, they've maybe answered not the right question, they submitted the wrong piece of work, perhaps they, and if the answer has absolutely nothing to do with the content from the course, that's sometimes an indication that they haven't actually written it themselves and it's a paid for service. There are all these sorts of things basically when you're marking a piece of work and it can just feel out of joint with what you're really expecting to come up. You can never, I think, you can't write on the script anything accusation. You can't say you've clearly copied this or you've clearly cheated this. You can't ever do that. Everywhere I've ever worked, you still have to mark the piece of work, even if it were later to be found to be plagiarized. So your best bet is just to mark the piece, keep a note of the number, report it through whatever channels your institution sets, and try not to worry about it too much.
So if I just, sorry, with that situation, we would, if we were marking online, we would be told to make a note of the mark. We still mark it like Annika says, but we don't enter the mark on the alternative. That's how our institution deals with it. You're left with a mark, and it may go to a disciplinary panel, and then you may be asked to provide the mark at a later date, but asked not to input it online at that stage.
And I think that shows the importance of asking these questions before you start marking, so that you don't violate local procedures like that. It's a really important point. But yeah, I think my biggest point is try not to disrupt your marking too much. You know, don't agonize over it too much. Don't worry. Just be professional, follow the procedure, and move on to the next script. I think the other thing that might happen this year is I don't think you can let us know in the chat if anyone has any particular worries about marking and assessment boycotts. Again, this is something really hard to be, too specific about. If local institutions and local unions are going to have slightly different approaches and rules as to what you should do, I think my best advice is if you're worried about not being able to mark because materials haven't been provided by people that you need to provide them in order to do your marking, then just try to plan a little bit ahead. Maybe ask your teaching lead, ahead of boycotts and things, or ahead of your marking coming in, what you might need to do if you haven't quite got the materials. It might be a case of just doing your best with what you've got. It might be a case of waiting until the boycott is over, but it's probably going to have some local organisational things that you need to ask about in your own institution. I'll pause there because I feel like I'm rambling. Go for it, Ralf.
And can I just add to that? Because so if any of you is already on the boycott, okay, or is doing that, just please follow the advice of your local union, okay, and follow their advice. There's sort of obligations you have, but how they are interpreted is often different. They're often differently interpreted between unions and your institution. We can't give you any advice. You should always do what the union says, always do what your institution says. You have to come to your own conclusions, and the differences may be very local here anyways. So just make sure you read carefully what your management sends around, and you read carefully what your union sends around, and then you make your decision based on both. There's Annika, can I throw in another problem that also relates to one of the piece of comments left on the Padlet, and there was one of you commenting that you were being advised to not give any feedback on script, but then you had afterwards lots of students coming to you asking why they were given certain grades. And so that is one reason why we would generally advise, as Chris has said, that you should leave some feedback there, okay, to make that process better for internal and external moderators and for students. But it also leads to another issue. I know some of you certainly at my institutions have come to me to ask, and that is, what do I do if a student comes and challenges a grade given? And because that can be a very uncomfortable situation, and you may encounter some students which are extremely pushy and challenging in that regard. And in some sense, the line we are having here at Manchester, we're trying to communicate, is that students cannot challenge academic judgments. And that's where it is important that you have in mind and perhaps communicate to students what John said, that process, their mark is not only your personal mark, but it's the mark agreed through a process. Right? So that is sort of a bit of defensive action you can certainly immediately wheel out. The second aspect here is that, you know, indeed, to keep in mind, students cannot challenge that academic judgment, but we should usually be happy to help students with providing feedback. So when a student comes to me, I sort of try and immediately challenge a discussion to, okay, look, you can't challenge the grade, but are you interested in some feedback to help you how to do better the next time? And typically students will sort of engage with that. That may not be what they came for. They came to get that 2-1, okay, rather than a 55. But if you give them that offer, they typically cannot say no, and you can try and guide that discussion in there. Should a student repeatedly try to get back to, yeah, but shouldn't I be getting a 2-1 for this? I'm also quite frank in saying, look, we shouldn't be having this discussion. I don't think we're getting anywhere, and advise them to either talk to the course convener or to whatever higher authority there is, and you should rest assured they will most likely back you.
So Alessia has put a great comment in the chat of what if after the challenge you realize the student is right. And I'm going to say that the first thing you should absolutely not do is say, oh my goodness, I completely agree, this marker was really mean and you've got something half the value you should have. Like, that's a really bad way to go. To add it up. In many ways, those ones where it's like completely provable, like marks have been added up incorrectly, you know, that's a case of saying, if you feel the need to say anything to the students at all, let me take that away. Or here's the email address you need to email, or whatever the thing is in your local institution, right?
But I would stress, sorry, go on.
No, go on, Chris.
No, I would stress, if this is at the GTA level, if you're doing this, the first thing to do is to talk about it with your module leader, because you know it's their responsibility really over you. You tell them what's happened, and it should be there, because these are big things that need to be handled with experience, don't they? And
you absolutely can't promise the students anything, you know, like you don't promise them anything there in the room.
That's right.
I think, oh, sorry. I was just going to say, the thing I was trying to get to is, like, there are sometimes I think we look at things and think they're a little bit harshly marked, or I would have been a little bit more flexible, or I would have said this in a different way. If what the student's written has been misinterpreted, they need to write clearer next time. They need to think about it. You know, it's not always going to be fair. And whilst I don't say to students, I think you shouldn't. I think I try to prepare students ahead of time that marks can always have some variation, and that is going to happen. But I wouldn't say to a student, I guess, like, I think this is worth a lot more or a lot less. Sorry, Ralf.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And you shouldn't put yourself in a situation where you feel that in a meeting with a student, you feel like you have to concede a point or something. Okay. So if you can, if you know a student is coming because they're challenging the mark, I would try and look at the piece beforehand, just to reassure myself and give myself confidence. Yeah, I think that grade is right. And I totally agree with Annika. You always will have second thoughts about that. Or 50, perhaps I could have given a 60, but that is, you will be able to do that with every single script you look at. Okay, so it's really about, at that stage, only correcting what are really significant mistakes, not small variations of grades. Okay, because that can always, someone can always ask that. So really only if you realize that that is absolutely a mistake, but then either have that cleared before you meet the student, or block the discussion do not feel drawn on any judgment in the meeting, and think afterwards together with your course convener about it. And you can then still send an email to the student. And, I looked at that together with my course convener. We came to the conclusion that that was a mistake, right? So take the pressure away in the meeting. In the meeting, no discussion about your grade.
Or even if you're not required to have discussions with them like that, then just push all conversations like that to the module convener. Say that all questions about marks have to go to the course convener. I've never run a course where via GTAs at least are required to give feedback on exams in that sense.
Okay, are there any other questions from you guys? I think that last point I've written down what sort of questions came from the Padlet we haven't addressed, and that point about subjectivity was raised, I think, by a couple of you, and we sort of addressed at this point, because yes, there is subjectivity. Never claim that there is one particular right answer. Okay, and that may indeed lead to, there was another comment on borderline marks. Okay, so if you mark a bigger piece, and that will determine whether someone will get a first or not in their course unit. What I always remember for myself is, okay, look, I don't know for sure what the right mark is here. When I'm thinking about borderlines, always tend to go into a generous mode and say, okay, if I can justify giving that extra mark that moves the student up to the next degree class, then yes, I'm giving that. I'm always first trying to find the extra mark, and only then I'm trying to move off the borderline into the other direction.
Can I just come in there, Ralf, actually? This is something worth checking. So I know at some places that number 9 is banned.
Yes.
Yeah, that you can't, and this is, if you're going to do some marking, this is probably worth double checking, that some places will say they don't want a 59, they don't want a 69, you have to decide what grade it is. And some places have got a real hang up with you giving 9s in your mark. So that might be something you want to double check before you start your marking. As a module leader or a department or an institution got a particular issue, or doesn't want you to give a 59 or a 69 because of this reason, they want you to say it's clearly a 2-2, for example, it's 58, or it's clearly it's a 60 or 61. You've got to come down one side of the fence or the other.
Although that usually refers to the overall grade in a unit and not to a particular assessment. So if there are multiple assessments, it's another reason to have spreadsheets, perhaps preloaded with all the other assessments, so you know what's the overall result once you finish a script. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, John, Annika, and Chris, for your